The people who save the most lives are often the ones nobody notices until it's too late. At 6:42 p.m., Abigail Hayes walked through the employee entrance of St. Matthew's Regional Medical Center, carrying a plain navy lunch bag and a coffee she had barely touched. She was 5'4", with neatly tied brown hair, pale skin that looked almost translucent beneath the fluorescent lights, and calm eyes that rarely revealed what she was thinking. Most people passing her in the hallway wouldn't have remembered her face 5 minutes later. That was exactly how Abigail preferred it. The emergency department was already running 23 patients over capacity by the time she clipped on her ID badge and headed toward the nurse's station. Voices overlapped beneath the constant rhythm of ringing phones and monitor alarms. Someone complained about staffing shortages. A resident muttered about missing dinner again. Another nurse rolled her eyes as stretchers lined the corridor. The charge nurse barely glanced up when Abigail arrived. "Station 4, she said, sliding over a stack of intake forms. "Vitals, documentation, and basic assessments. We've got enough people trying to play hero tonight." A few exhausted laughs drifted through the station. Abigail accepted the clipboard with a small nod. Understood. She never argued assignments. Never reminded anyone she'd been there before sunrise all week. Never volunteered stories that made people stop talking. Instead, she sanitized her hands, adjusted the stethoscope around her neck, and began checking equipment at Station 4. Blood pressure cuffs, pulse oximeter, thermometer covers. For supplies, she counted everything twice, organized tubing by size, tested the monitor connections. A younger nurse passing by smirked. "You know central supply exists, right?" Abigail looked up briefly. "I know emergencies don't wait for deliveries." The nurse shrugged and disappeared down the hallway. Within minutes, patients filled every available space. Abigail moved quietly between them, introducing herself in the same steady voice each time. She listened more than she spoke. She noticed the elderly man who kept insisting he was fine despite rubbing his chest every few minutes. The teenager pretending not to be scared while glancing repeatedly toward his mother. The woman apologizing for taking up space while trying not to grimace every time she shifted in her chair. Other staff members saw diagnoses. Abigail noticed breathing patterns, hesitation before movement, changes in skin color beneath artificial light. Tiny details. Easy to dismiss. Easy to miss. "You're too thorough," one resident commented as she documented another set of vital signs. "Half these people will be discharged in an hour." Abigail secured the blood pressure cuff and offered a polite smile. "I hope you're right." The resident had already moved on before she finished speaking. At 7:18 p.m., she paused beside a middle-aged patient waiting for imaging and studied the monitor for 3 silent seconds. The numbers looked acceptable. Heart rate within normal limits. Oxygen saturation stable. Blood pressure not alarming anyone. Around her, the department continued moving at full speed. Nobody noticed Abigail's expression change almost imperceptibly. Her fingers rested lightly against the patient's wrist as she counted again. Once, twice. Then she lifted her eyes toward the hallway beyond Station 4, where chaos always seemed one door away. Something wasn't right. Abigail kept her fingers against the patient's wrist for another 10 seconds while the monitor above him continued its reassuring rhythm. 78 beats per minute. Oxygen saturation at 97%. Blood pressure only slightly elevated. On paper, everything suggested stability. But the pulse beneath her fingertips told a different story. There was an irregular hesitation between beats, subtle enough that most people would have dismissed it as anxiety or fatigue. She looked at the patient again. He was in his early 50s, dressed in a wrinkled button-down shirt, apologizing each time someone passed his stretcher. "I am sorry to be a bother," he said with an uneasy smile. "It is probably just stress. My daughter insisted I come in." Abigail adjusted the blanket over his legs. "How long have you been feeling uncomfortable?" "A few hours. Maybe indigestion." He attempted another smile, but she noticed how carefully he controlled his breathing, how his left hand occasionally drifted toward his upper chest before retreating as though embarrassed by the gesture. She checked his capillary refill time. Slightly delayed. The skin around his mouth held a faint gray undertone that the bright emergency department lights almost erased. Almost. Abigail picked up the chart and approached a resident physician reviewing laboratory requests nearby. Dr. Ethan Pierce was in his second year of residency and moving through the department with the confidence of someone determined to prove himself. He barely looked up as she stopped beside him. "Room 12, Abigail said quietly. "I think he needs another evaluation." Ethan scanned the chart. His electrocardiogram was unremarkable. Labs are pending. Vitals are stable. His pulse pattern has changed. People are nervous in emergency rooms. Abigail remained calm. His presentation does not match anxiety. Ethan finally glanced at her. "You think he is unstable?" "I think something is evolving." He exhaled through his nose and checked the board filled with waiting patients. "Abigail, we have ambulances coming in and 12 people waiting for beds. If every slight variation became an emergency, none of us would survive this shift." Around them, phones rang continuously while overhead pages called physicians to different departments. A nurse rushed past carrying supplies. Someone laughed too loudly at the station before returning to work. The emergency department never slowed long enough for uncertainty. Ethan handed the chart back. "Repeat vitals in 30 minutes. Let me know if anything actually changes." "Understood," Abigail replied. She returned to room 12 without protest. The patient looked relieved when he saw her. "Good news?" he asked. "We are going to keep monitoring you," she said gently. "I would like to ask a few more questions." As he answered, Abigail listened to more than words. She listened to pauses between sentences, the effort required to maintain normal conversation, the slight tightening around his eyes whenever discomfort passed through him. She documented each observation with precise handwriting before checking the emergency cart nearest Station 4. Oxygen tubing, intravenous supplies, cardiac pads, everything arranged exactly where it belonged. Another nurse noticed her preparations. "You expecting something?" Abigail secured the cabinet door and looked back toward room 12. "I hope not," she answered softly. Then, for the second time that evening, she counted the rhythm beneath the patient's wrist and felt the unmistakable sensation that time was running faster than anyone else in the room realized. At 7:41 p.m., the emergency department settled into the kind of uneasy rhythm that fooled people into believing they had caught up. Monitors beeped steadily. Stretchers rolled through hallways. Nurses updated charts while physicians moved from room to room with practiced urgency. For a few brief minutes, the chaos softened around the edges. Abigail stood outside room 12 reviewing the latest vital signs she had collected herself. Blood pressure had decreased by 8 points since the previous assessment. Heart rate remained within normal range, but no longer held its earlier consistency. Respiratory rate had increased slightly. Small changes, easy to explain away individually, difficult to ignore when viewed together. Inside the room, the patient shifted carefully against the pillow. "Miss Hayes," he asked, "can I ask you something?" Abigail stepped closer. "Of course. Am I overreacting by being here?" He glanced toward the hallway where more seriously ill patients passed by. "I keep thinking there are people who need help more than I do." Abigail adjusted the pulse oximeter on his finger. "The emergency department is not a competition," she said gently. "You came because something felt different. That matters." He studied her expression. "You sound very sure of that." She met his eyes. "People usually know when their normal changes." He nodded slowly. "My daughter said the same thing." Abigail documented his responses before excusing herself to locate Dr. Ethan Pierce once again. She found him reviewing imaging reports near the central station. "Room 12's blood pressure is trending downward," she said. "Respiratory rate is climbing. I would like another electrocardiogram and repeat labs." Ethan rubbed tired eyes before looking toward the crowded board. "Abigail, his numbers are still acceptable." "They are changing. Everyone's numbers change." "His pattern is concerning." Ethan lowered his voice. "You are a very good nurse. I know that. But there is a difference between being attentive and creating emergencies that are not there." Several staff members within earshot pretended not to listen while clearly listening anyway. Abigail remained composed. "I understand." "Then trust the process," Ethan replied. "If something significant happens, call me immediately." She accepted the answer without argument. "Understood." Back at Station 4, another nurse leaned beside her while organizing supplies. "You really think something is wrong with him?" Abigail secured fresh intravenous tubing into the emergency cart drawer. "I think waiting sometimes costs more than people realize." "You always talk like that?" the nurse asked with a nervous laugh. Abigail paused before answering. Only when I am worried. The nurse studied her face for a moment. You do not look worried. Abigail glanced toward room 12 through the open doorway. That does not mean I am not. The patient had closed his eyes, but his breathing remained slightly shallow beneath the blanket. Monitor alarms from another section of the department briefly pulled attention away. Overhead speakers announced incoming ambulance traffic with estimated arrival times. A resident cursed under his breath while searching for an attending physician. The emergency department was preparing for another wave before recovering from the first. Abigail walked quietly back into room 12 and rested 2 fingers against the patient's wrist once more. The hesitation in the rhythm had become more pronounced. Not dramatic enough to trigger alarms. Not obvious enough to stop the room, but enough for her to feel it. Enough for old instincts she never discussed to sharpen beneath the surface. She adjusted the patient's blanket again and offered a reassuring smile that never reached the concern hidden behind her calm eyes. Then she looked toward the hallway filling with fresh activity and realized the window to act was growing smaller with every passing minute. At 7:58 p.m., the overhead speaker crackled with an announcement that instantly changed the atmosphere inside St. Matthew's Regional Medical Center. Attention emergency department. Multiple vehicle collision inbound. Estimated arrival in 4 minutes. 6 incoming patients. 2 critical evaluations requested. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Chairs scraped against the floor. The fragile rhythm the department had rebuilt dissolved into motion. Nurses moved toward supply carts. Residents checked available treatment bays. Stretchers rolled into position beneath bright fluorescent lights. Dr. Ethan Pierce looked up at the trauma board and muttered something under his breath before heading toward the ambulance entrance. All available hands, the charge nurse called out. Move. We are reopening trauma 2 and 3. Abigail secured the chart she had been updating and immediately began preparing Station 4. Intravenous kits, oxygen supplies, monitoring equipment, everything arranged with quiet efficiency. Her movements remained measured while the pace around her accelerated. Another nurse hurried past carrying extra linens. You are too calm, she said. Abigail glanced toward room 12 before answering. Calm helps people think. The nurse offered a tense smile before disappearing into the growing crowd. Through the open doorway, room 12's patient watched the sudden activity with concern. That sounds serious, he said as Abigail stepped back inside. There was an accident nearby, she explained gently. More patients are arriving. He shifted against the pillow and drew a slower breath than before. Maybe I should let you focus on them instead. Abigail checked his blood pressure manually this time. The reading dropped lower than before. Not dramatically, not enough to trigger panic, but enough to deepen the concern settling quietly in her chest. You are one of my patients too, she said. You are not taking help away from anyone. He attempted a smile. My daughter would like you. Abigail adjusted the blanket again. I think I would like her too. Outside, ambulance doors opened. The emergency department transformed into organized urgency. Paramedics gave rapid reports while patients were guided toward available spaces. Families waited anxiously near entrances. Questions overlapped with instructions. Dr. Pierce rushed between trauma bays while another resident searched for imaging availability. The charge nurse scanned the department and pointed toward Abigail. Station 4 overflow. We need those beds turning over fast. Abigail nodded. Understood. Yet before stepping away, she placed 2 fingers against room 12's wrist one more time. The pulse felt weaker beneath his skin. The hesitation she had noticed earlier had evolved into inconsistency she could no longer dismiss. She looked at the monitor. Heart rate remained deceptively acceptable. Oxygen saturation still reassured anyone glancing quickly at the screen. Machines measured numbers. Her hands measured change. Abigail rose and moved directly toward Dr. Pierce. He had just finished receiving an ambulance report when she stopped beside him. Room 12 needs immediate reassessment, she said. Ethan looked exhausted. Abigail, not now. His condition is changing. Everyone's condition is changing tonight. Please, she replied, her voice steady but firmer than before. He needs another electrocardiogram and physician evaluation now. Ethan looked toward the overflowing trauma area before turning back to her. Give me 10 minutes. Abigail's eyes drifted toward room 12. Then back to Ethan. I do not think he has 10 minutes. For the first time since the shift began, Dr. Ethan Pierce truly looked at her face. There was no fear there, no dramatics, no desperation, only certainty. Around them, the emergency department surged beneath the pressure of new arrivals, while somewhere beyond the noise of monitors and hurried footsteps, Abigail Hayes listened to instincts that had never failed her before. Dr. Ethan Pierce held Abigail's gaze for half a second before another resident called his name from the trauma base. He hesitated, caught between competing emergencies, then looked back toward room 12. "Repeat the electrocardiogram," he said quickly. "I will be there as soon as I can." Abigail nodded once and turned immediately toward the room. She did not rush. She never rushed. Her movements became even more deliberate when time mattered most. The patient looked up as she entered, carrying fresh leads and monitoring supplies. "Am I causing trouble?" he asked quietly. Abigail offered a reassuring smile while sanitizing her hands. "Not at all. I just want another look at a few things." She adjusted the bed slightly higher and attached the electrocardiogram leads with practiced precision. While the machine processed, she placed her fingers against his radial pulse again. The rhythm felt thinner now, as though each beat required more effort than the one before. She studied his face. His skin had become cooler despite the warm department temperature. There was a faint sheen across his forehead. His breathing remained controlled, but every inhale seemed just a fraction shallower. "How would you describe the discomfort now?" she asked. "Different," he admitted. "Not worse exactly. Just heavier." Abigail nodded. "Any nausea?" "A little. Lightheaded. When I moved earlier." She documented each answer before manually rechecking his blood pressure. Lower again. Not enough to set off alarms. Enough to confirm the pattern she had been tracking for nearly an hour. She glanced toward the monitor. The numbers still looked reassuring to anyone seeing them for the first time. But numbers taken in isolation rarely told the whole story. Abigail reached for the patient's hand. "I need you to tell me immediately if anything changes, even if it feels small." He gave a weak smile. "You really do not miss much, do you?" Her expression softened. "People usually tell us what is happening long before machines do." Outside the room, the emergency department remained under pressure from incoming patients. Voices echoed through hallways. Stretchers moved past open doors. Yet inside room 12, Abigail focused entirely on details others had overlooked. The slight delay before he answered questions. The effort hidden behind casual conversation. The pulse that no longer matched the monitor's confidence. Dr. Pierce stepped into the doorway at last, still holding another patient's chart. "Show me," he said. Abigail handed him the updated documentation. Blood pressure has continued trending down. Respiratory rate increased. Pulse quality is weaker. Symptoms are evolving. Ethan reviewed the repeated electrocardiogram. "It still does not look dramatic." "No," Abigail agreed calmly. "But he does." Ethan glanced from the tracing to the patient, then back to Abigail. "What do you think we are missing?" She lowered her voice. "I think he is compensating. I think whatever is happening has not declared itself fully yet." "Based on what?" Ethan asked. Abigail looked toward the patient resting quietly beneath the blanket. His skin tone changed before his numbers did. His pulse changed before the monitor reflected it. He is working harder to breathe without realizing it. The story stopped matching the data 30 minutes ago. Ethan stared at her for a moment. Around them, another overhead page requested assistance elsewhere. Yet for the first time that evening, he did not immediately dismiss her concerns. He stepped closer to the bedside and examined the patient himself. Then his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Order repeat labs," he said quietly. "Add cardiac enzymes, and call for immediate physician review." Abigail simply nodded and moved to carry out the orders. There was no satisfaction in being right, only relief that someone else had finally started listening. By 8:19 p.m., the emergency department had settled into the controlled disorder familiar to every hospital after a major influx of patients. The immediate crisis had spread itself across treatment rooms and hallways, transforming urgency into endurance. Nurses moved with tired efficiency. Residents chased laboratory results and imaging reports. Families waited beside doors that opened and closed without explanation. Through it all, Abigail Hayes continued working with the same steady rhythm she had carried since the beginning of her shift. She drew blood samples for repeat testing, confirmed medication histories, adjusted monitoring leads that had loosened, and answered frightened questions in a voice calm enough to slow breathing. Room 12 remained her silent point of focus. The patient rested with his eyes closed now, though not comfortably. His color remained subtly altered beneath the fluorescent lights. His pulse had not recovered its earlier strength. Abigail completed another assessment without announcing concern. Blood pressure, respiratory effort, skin temperature, mental status. Small pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit the reassuring narrative everyone preferred. As she documented her findings, she became aware of someone standing just outside the doorway. Dr. Ethan Pierce had returned, but he was not alone. Beside him stood Chief of Surgery Daniel Whitmore. At 61 years old, Whitmore carried himself with the composed authority of someone who had spent decades making impossible decisions. He had a reputation throughout St. Matthew's Regional Medical Center for precision, discipline, and expectations few people consistently met. Staff members lowered their voices when he entered a room. Abigail acknowledged him with a polite nod before continuing her work. Whitmore observed silently as she reassessed the patient. She checked the blood pressure cuff placement before inflating it manually rather than relying solely on automated readings. She compared pulse quality between wrists. She noted respiratory patterns before glancing at monitor values. She adjusted the patient's position by only a few degrees and reassessed comfort levels. Nothing appeared dramatic to an outside observer. Nothing seemed extraordinary. Yet every movement had purpose. "What are you looking for?" Whitmore finally asked. Abigail secured the blood pressure cuff and answered without hesitation. "Consistency." "Explain." She glanced toward the patient before responding. "The monitor provides information. The patient provides context. When they disagree, I trust neither until I understand why." Whitmore folded his arms. "You think they disagree?" "I think his body has been compensating." Ethan stood nearby, listening more carefully than before. Abigail continued documenting while speaking. "His numbers remain acceptable in isolation. But trends matter. Pulse quality changed before monitor values reflected it. Skin tone shifted. Breathing effort increased. Subjective symptoms evolved despite reassuring data." Whitmore's expression remained unreadable. "How long have you been tracking these changes?" 58 minutes, Abigail replied. "You remember the exact timeline?" Ethan asked. Abigail looked down at her notes. "People remember moments when they believe something important is happening." Whitmore stepped toward the bedside and performed his own assessment. The patient opened his eyes and attempted another apologetic smile. "Am I in trouble, doctor?" Whitmore studied him for several seconds before answering. "No, sir. We are simply being thorough." He stepped back and looked toward Abigail again. Around them, overhead pages continued. Stretchers rolled through distant hallways. Someone laughed nervously at the nurse's station before returning to work. The emergency department never truly paused. Yet Whitmore's attention remained fixed on the quiet nurse who had never raised her voice once throughout the evening. Abigail finished charting, adjusted the patient's blanket, and quietly prepared additional supplies before they had been requested. She did not seek acknowledgement. She did not explain herself further. She simply moved to the next necessary task with the same composed focus. Dr. Whitmore watched her for another long moment, and for perhaps the first time in years, the seasoned surgeon found himself less interested in the patient before him and more curious about the woman who somehow seemed to notice what everyone else had overlooked. At 8:34 p.m., the first laboratory updates returned while St. Matthew's Emergency Department continued operating beneath the relentless pressure of another crowded evening. Nurses exchanged quick reports between patient rooms. Residents moved through unfinished tasks with coffee growing cold at their stations. The controlled urgency had become background noise. But inside room 12, something had shifted. The patient opened his eyes and pressed a hand lightly against the blanket covering his chest. "Miss Hayes," he said softly, "I do not know how to explain it." Abigail stepped to his bedside immediately. "Try." He took a careful breath. "I just do not feel right anymore." His voice remained steady, but she noticed the slight delay before each answer now. The effort hidden beneath ordinary conversation had become impossible for her to ignore. Abigail checked his pulse again. The hesitation she had tracked for more than an hour no longer felt subtle. She glanced toward the monitor. Heart rate remained deceptively acceptable. Oxygen saturation held steady. The machine still suggested reassurance. Her fingertips did not. "Dr. Pierce," she called calmly toward the hallway. Ethan appeared moments later, accompanied by Chief Whitmore. "What changed?" Ethan asked. Abigail looked up from the bedside. "He is tiring." Whitmore moved closer. Specifically, his responses are slower. Pulse quality has declined further. Respiratory effort increased despite stable readings. Ethan frowned. "His monitor still looks acceptable." Abigail gently repositioned the blood pressure cuff and repeated the measurement manually. The numbers returned lower again. She documented the reading before speaking. Compensation eventually runs out. The patient attempted another smile. "You make me sound dramatic." Abigail met his eyes. "You trusted yourself enough to come here tonight. Let us trust that instinct a little longer." Before anyone could answer, the patient closed his eyes briefly and exhaled more heavily than before. The monitor tone altered slightly. Not alarming. Different. Ethan's posture changed immediately. "Repeat electrocardiogram. Call cardiology consult." Abigail was already moving. Fresh leads. Updated documentation. Oxygen prepared but not applied unnecessarily. Emergency medications verified. Every action occurred without wasted motion. Chief Whitmore watched in silence. She anticipated needs before requests were spoken. She adjusted positioning before discomfort worsened. She reassessed circulation while explaining each step to reassure the patient. There was no panic in her voice. No hesitation in her hands. The room itself seemed to slow around her certainty. Ethan stared at the newest tracing as it printed. His expression tightened. "This was not here earlier." "No," Abigail answered quietly. "It was not." Whitmore looked from the electrocardiogram to Abigail. "You expected this." She shook her head slightly. "I hoped I was wrong." The patient looked between them with growing concern. "Should I be worried?" Abigail adjusted the blanket near his shoulder. "You are exactly where you need to be." Additional staff entered as consults were requested. Questions filled the room. Orders were repeated. Yet Chief Whitmore found his attention returning repeatedly to the quiet nurse standing near the bedside. He had spent decades training physicians to recognize deterioration. He had watched brilliant surgeons develop judgment through years of repetition and loss. But what he had witnessed tonight was something different. It was observation sharpened beyond routine, instinct supported by discipline, technical precision without ego. He studied Abigail Hayes as she documented the exact timeline of changes from memory, then prepared the next intervention before anyone realized it might be needed. Finally, almost to himself, the seasoned surgeon lowered his voice and asked the question that silenced everyone nearest to him. "Who trained her?" The room grew unexpectedly still. Abigail paused only long enough to glance toward the patient resting beneath the monitor's steady rhythm. Then she returned to her work and answered in the same calm tone she had used all night. "People who could not afford mistakes." For a few seconds after Abigail spoke, nobody in room 12 said anything. The steady hum of monitors filled the silence while the emergency department continued moving just beyond the doorway. Chief Whitmore held the latest electrocardiogram in one hand, but his attention remained fixed on the nurse standing beside the patient. "People who could not afford mistakes," he repeated quietly. Abigail finished documenting the patient's updated assessment before responding. "Yes, sir." Ethan Pierce looked up from the chart. "What does that mean?" Abigail adjusted the patient's blanket and checked the intravenous line one more time before answering. "It means that when resources are limited, hesitation has consequences." The patient, still alert despite his fatigue, attempted a small smile. "Sounds like you have had an interesting career." Abigail returned the smile politely. "I have worked in a few different environments." Whitmore studied her face. "Emergency medicine?" "Among other things." "Military?" Ethan asked before he could stop himself. Abigail paused briefly as she organized supplies back into precise order. "A long time ago," she said. Her voice carried no pride, no mystery designed to impress. Only fact. Whitmore's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Combat medic?" Abigail closed the emergency cart drawer. "I learned from people who expected preparation before panic." Ethan stared at her. "You noticed all of this before any of us because of military experience?" Abigail shook her head slightly. "No. I noticed because I paid attention." She looked toward room 12's patient. He was telling us something from the beginning. His body simply spoke more quietly than most. The patient chuckled softly despite the circumstances. "I have been accused of that before." Abigail adjusted the pulse oximeter on his finger. Quiet things still deserve to be heard. Outside the room, another overhead page called for physician assistance. Stretchers rolled across polished floors. Family members waited anxiously beside vending machines and coffee cups gone cold. St. Matthew's Regional Medical Center continued functioning as it always had. Yet within room 12, something fundamental had shifted. Ethan no longer saw Abigail as the overly cautious nurse who questioned stable readings. Whitmore no longer viewed her as another competent staff member quietly completing assigned tasks. They had watched her build a clinical picture from fragments everyone else had dismissed. They had watched her remain calm without becoming detached, prepared without becoming dramatic, confident without demanding recognition. Why never mention it? Ethan finally asked. Abigail considered the question while checking the patient's blood pressure once more. Because patients do not need my history, she answered. They need my attention. Whitmore lowered the electrocardiogram report. Most people would have led with credentials. Abigail secured the cuff and documented the reading. Titles do not improve outcomes. The patient looked at her thoughtfully. You know, he said, my daughter teaches 3rd grade. She always says the best teachers are the ones who make difficult things feel simple. Abigail smiled faintly. Your daughter sounds wise. Additional laboratory updates arrived moments later, confirming concerns serious enough to justify immediate intervention planning. Ethan reviewed them and exhaled slowly before looking back toward Abigail. There was respect in his expression now, not because of whatever experiences she had chosen not to describe, but because she had stayed present long enough to notice what everyone else had missed. Chief Whitmore glanced once more at the quiet nurse resetting supplies for the next patient before speaking in a lower voice, meant only for Ethan. Technical skill can be taught, he said. Discipline can be reinforced. But judgment like that. He stopped and looked toward Abigail as she reassured room 12's patient with the same steady tone she had used all evening. That comes from carrying responsibility long enough to understand exactly what it costs when people stop paying attention. By 9:07 p.m., the emergency department had begun settling into the aftermath of another demanding evening. The immediate rush had eased just enough for people to notice what had happened inside room 12. The patient's condition had been recognized in time. Consultations had been completed. Appropriate treatment plans had moved forward without unnecessary delay. What could have become a story of missed opportunities had instead become an example of what careful attention could change. The patient rested more comfortably now, color gradually returning to features that had appeared increasingly strained only hours earlier. When Abigail entered to complete another assessment, he offered her a tired but genuine smile. My daughter is going to be very happy you listened to me, he said. Abigail adjusted the blanket near his shoulder and checked the monitor one final time. Your daughter was right to encourage you to come in. He studied her for a moment. I think you saved me from becoming one of those people who says they should have paid attention sooner. Abigail shook her head gently. You listened to your instincts. The rest was teamwork. He laughed softly. That sounds exactly like something someone humble would say. She finished documenting his updated status before placing the chart back at the foot of the bed. Get some rest, she replied. I think your daughter would want you saving your energy for her. Outside the room, Ethan Pierce stood near the nurse's station reviewing the events of the evening in silence. When Abigail approached to return supplies, he shifted awkwardly before speaking. I owe you an apology. Abigail paused. For what? I thought you were overreacting. He glanced toward room 12. I thought experience meant recognizing emergencies after they became obvious. Abigail considered his words. Most people do. Ethan folded his arms. How do you learn to trust what cannot be measured immediately? Abigail looked around the department. Nurses restocked carts. Environmental services cleaned empty spaces. Families waited for updates. Residents prepared for whatever would come next. You learn that medicine is not only numbers, she answered. People change before charts do. The difficult part is slowing down enough to notice. Ethan nodded slowly. I will remember that. Near the end of the hallway, Chief Whitmore watched the exchange before approaching. For several moments, he said nothing. Then he extended his hand toward Abigail Hayes. St. Matthew's is fortunate to have you. Abigail accepted the gesture politely. I am fortunate to work with people willing to reconsider what they think they know. Whitmore allowed himself the faintest smile. You know, after 30 years in surgery, I believed I understood exactly what expertise looked like. His eyes moved briefly toward room 12. Tonight reminded me that true competence is often quieter than confidence. Abigail lowered her gaze slightly. The patients do not care who gets credit. No, Whitmore agreed. They care who pays attention. The overhead speaker announced another incoming ambulance. A nurse called for assistance down the hall. The emergency department inhaled before beginning again. Abigail clipped a fresh pin onto her pocket, checked the supply levels at Station 4, and prepared for the next patient without ceremony. No one applauded. No formal recognition followed. She did not reveal old photographs or share stories from another chapter of her life. She simply moved toward the work still waiting to be done. As Ethan watched her disappear into the familiar rhythm of the department, he understood something that years of textbooks had never fully taught him. The people who make the greatest difference are not always the loudest voices in the room. Sometimes they are the ones who listen closely enough to hear what everyone else overlooks. And respect, he realized as the doors opened for another patient seeking help, is not earned through titles, recognition, or reputation. Respect is earned in silence.